Wow, what a great series of speakers we've had this morning. Really inspiring. I was particularly struck by a comment that James made in his talk about how fast technology is moving in this space. And then, of course, David and Ross have both talked extensively about VR. And I sort of asked the question, have you ever wondered where VR came from? And because when I was growing up, VR looked like this. And maybe it has taken a long time for this initial research. This book was not an international bestseller, you won't be surprised to hear. But it's actually a real work of art, and you can still get copies on eBay if you're interested. My first slide is actually one that I introduced at IAPT Connect 17 2 years ago. And two things have happened since then. One is that all of these technologies you see listed here have moved on forward in leaps and bounds. Actually, if you do an analysis of the news at the moment, there are more references to AI in a week than there are to Brexit. The other thing that's happened is that my role has evolved somewhat. And this is kind of according to a secret agenda where the operational teams in Mayden have gone to the marketing team in Mayden and said, we really want to stop Chris from interfering. What can you do? And so the marketing says, just don't worry, leave it with us. You might just start receiving lots of invitations to speak at various conferences. And that's what's happened. In fact, they over-excelled themselves because not only did they manage to keep me out of the office for quite a while, but they actually kept me out of the country for the last 8 weeks, speaking at various events. But wherever I'm speaking, and whatever I'm speaking on, which is always to do with IAPT and what we've been doing over in England, I always try and include this slide. And the reason is because it's obviously deliberately provocative. But it gets a conversation going, which is what we want to do. And afterwards, after I've finished speaking, we have all of the questions or people come to talk to me afterwards, it's always this that they want to talk about. And the point, of course, is that not that all of our jobs are going to be taken over by robots. David's made that absolutely clear. Not yet. There are lots of people who are betting against David and investing millions of pounds. At some point in the future, actually this will happen. But it's not something I don't think that we're going to have to worry about today. The point of this slide is actually all these technologies are available and we can actually use them to our advantage now. And shortly I want to talk to you about a project called SAPIO that we're working on and hopefully invite you to get involved in that. In order to take these technologies forward, we need these 4 things. As a company, as Mayden, we would need these 4 things. So we need a mandate, first of all. We need data. We need to know what we're doing and have the capability and capacity to move forward. We also need your help. Just to address the first of those points, Mayden, as a company, rarely does anything without doing it to somebody else's agenda. Sometimes that might be David's agenda, or it might be some of our clients' agenda, etc. Everything that we do is actually driven by all of the feedback we get from our clients. And in terms of this agenda moving forward, we now have a Secretary of State who's very pro-digital and is recognising that the world is changing and recognising that it needs to be put into healthcare. Data is something that we need if we're going to do data-driven mental health care, which is the title of this talk. Now, we support a system called IAPT, which most of you will be familiar with, some of you won't. We support 130 adult services today and 40 children's and young people services. And that's just across England. We also have clients in Australia and Northern Ireland. And to date, within the IAPT databases, we have over 5 million patients registered. We're kind of running at the moment about 1.2 million referrals a year, and just under 6 million clinical sessions a year. And as you can see on the map, we're actually covering the length and breadth of the country. The scale of that challenge is going to increase. David has shown the graph quite dramatically. These are the big numbers here. Just under 2 million patients being referred into IAPTs over the next few years. And we anticipate that by the time we get there, about 1.5 million of those will end up on IAPT's databases at some point. And we actually, and that is a huge challenge to deal with that number of patients, even in just the small number of services that we've got. And so, as a company, Mayden wants to use all of these technologies that you saw on the previous slide to actually help our clients and our customers to make the most of those, to be able to deal with what is actually a huge volume of activity. Of course, it's not our data, it's your data. And so we do need to help, for you to help us in actually working with your data to actually be able to give you all of the benefits that are locked up within those databases. The next is capability and capacity. Can we do this? And I'm just, for the next few slides, going to go on a slight commercial break because one of the issues that we've identified in successive kind of user surveys of our IAPT's product is that loads and loads of people who use our product know the product, IAPT's, but they don't know the company behind it. And as a company, Mayden never set out to be one of those nameless, faceless organisations that sometimes occupy sort of healthcare IT territory. As Alison said in her opening talk, the relationships that we have with you are really important to us. And collaboration is absolutely key, working with people. And so we want to take that forward. And actually that's the reason why originally we created the Connect events 2 years ago. As part of that collaboration, as part of the networking, actually all trying to understand each other and what our various needs are. Alison actually spoke out our purpose earlier this morning, and it's written on the screen there. This is what we're about. We have a company of 80 people now. When IAPT started, we were actually only 8. We've grown tenfold over the last 10 years. As IAPT has grown, we have grown. We now have lots of software developers, and you can see the list on the screen. About 20 to 25 of our staff are actually in the auditorium at the moment. And please go and seek them out and speak to them. They're all wearing orange flowers, as Alison told you earlier. We operate from 3 data centres. 2 of them are in England and 1 of them is in Sydney. We are compliant with the NHS Data Security and Protection Toolkit, formerly the IG Toolkit, and actually our score for the last decade has pretty much been 100% on that. But a few years ago, we also were one of the first organisations in healthcare to get ISO 27001 Information Security Management Certificate, and that's something that we've retained over that period, and of course we intend to, because looking after your data, keeping it safe and confidential is extremely important to us. It's probably the most important thing to us. And actually making sure that we build systems that are clinically safe is also absolutely key to what that we do. What you may not know, because actually we're not very good at sort of publicising our achievements, is just in the last few years we've actually won quite a lot of major awards that we're really proud of. And I'd like to commend the team to you for this, because this is not my work, this is the work of everybody in the company. I'm particularly proud of the one we won at the end of last year, which is UK Software Development Team of the Year, and that was from the British Computer Society. We've actually also been winners of 2 SBRI awards, both of which I'm about to mention in a moment. But actually, that's across a range of things that we could actually get awards for. That's quite a nice selection. One of the awards was an SBRI award from a few years ago, and that actually led to the development of PRISM. Many of you will be familiar with PRISM. David said earlier that patients aren't really using a lot of these online technologies, and it's certainly true that they're not using them in the numbers that we'd like them to. But today, we have 12 digital therapy companies connected to IAPT through the PRISM platform, sitting on this right-hand side. And effectively, they are integrated with the face-to-face therapy that goes on in IAPT. And right now, 70,000 patients a year actually pass through that PRISM platform forwards and backwards. So the numbers are growing. In the context of IAPT, it's actually quite a reasonable number, but actually we want to get it even higher over the next few years. PRISM is just one of the many things that we have done to actually connect with other organisations. Interoperability is actually a very key plank of the digital agenda that we've all got to follow. And IT companies, healthcare IT companies, have not been very good at this, and let's be honest, we've had a number of national programmes where we've failed to deliver connected care. We've tried our best to actually follow that agenda ever since we were incepted. Just 3 years into launching IAPT, we were the first company to connect to the NHS Spine, to the PDS lookup service. We were the first company to actually pass discharge documentation into EMIS GP practices through the MIG, and so on and so forth. In 2019, we've also already launched hybrid mail, where people can actually send all the letters to a hybrid mail house rather than having to stuff the envelopes and post them themselves. We've launched Mesh, which is a new GP messaging system. And hopefully by the end of the year, if certainly not the calendar year, then the financial year, we hope finally to achieve integration with Rio, where effectively people using IAPT will be able to see if the patient they're treating is actually on the Rio system, which in a lot of our clients is the main trust system, but equally users of Rio will actually be able to see a summary of an IAPT patient record at the same time. And this is something that we've actually wanted to do for a long time, and it's finally going to arrive. What I'd like to do now, though, is talk to you about a project that we're working on, and really is the substance of this talk, called SAPIO. This again is being funded by an SBRI award, which we got towards the end, earlier this year. Our company, following lots of conversations with services and our clients, is basing its agenda around 6 themes that you can see on this chart. And I'm not going to talk to you about all of the themes. You can kind of read what they are. There's a lot more information to talk about, and that would take me the entirety of this talk. We've just talked about the interoperability agenda, but SAPIO effectively covers all of the other 5 themes that we're working on at the moment. And what SAPIO is an attempt, and a number of speakers have actually alluded to this morning already, is to actually support therapists with the whole pathway between the referral of the patient to the start of treatment, and by trying to digitise and automate as much of that process as possible. David particularly alluded to digital triage, which takes therapists a lot of time. We actually want to introduce digital technologies to actually help speed up all of those processes, ultimately to allow therapists to spend most of their time treating patients and not doing all of the stuff that isn't really achieving that. It starts with trying to standardise the assessments. So when IAPT was launched, we standardised the data set, we standardised the outcome measures, we standardised the step care pathway, but actually we allowed services to create their own assessment processes. And that means that we now have 140 IAPT services, all of whom have a very different assessment process that starts their patient journey. What we don't want to do is create a standardised assessment that everybody has to use. We're actually trying to do something a bit more ambitious than that. What we want to do is actually create a standardised framework that actually we can fit everybody's assessment processes onto, so that actually what they get out at the end of it is the assessment process that they're familiar with. But now it's actually part of a standardised framework. And once it's in a standardised format, then we can actually use that data to do some quite wonderful things with it, such as this. So imagine you're a patient going into therapy, you have an assessment, your profile is effectively collected, all of this phenotyping, I think somebody mentioned earlier, I think it was James again, data, and then that can be used to actually predict what might happen to that person in the future. So as a patient, you would do my assessment. The machine learning algorithms will go and find all of the patients in the database and the millions that we talk about that are like me and have a similar assessment and have a similar profile to me. And then, based on the interventions that those patients have had and the outcomes they achieve, we'll actually start to predict the outcomes for that particular patient that's in front of us now. This is a typical IAPT screen, for those of you familiar with it. We call that the boarding card, the bit at the top. It's just a summary of the patients with a few labels and alerts on it. And just underneath that, you'll see a number of tabs, and one of them is highlighted green. It's a new tab that we're planning to introduce called Insights. This is what it looks like in a little bit more detail. This, by the way, is just a prototype. This particular version will probably never see the light of day for reasons which I won't go into now. But it's a kind of an idea of what we could potentially do with the data. And in this particular case, patient dummy has predictions of the different therapy outcomes that they will get with different types of therapy, including actually the therapist that will give them that outcome, the cost of that, the number of sessions that they're likely to have to go through in order to get to recovery. As you can see in this example, it's predicting for this patient that cognitive behavioural therapy with John Smith for 5 sessions will actually achieve an 88% chance of recovery. This is not a league table. This is, and it's a really important point, this is a list of predictions for this patient. Another patient will get a very different list. And we've been running tests on this, and it's absolutely true that different lists are coming out for different patients based on as the machine learns and uses the historical data. You can see from this example, though, that John Smith actually doesn't have a lot of availability. His diary is quite full. So we can expand that and actually look at some of the other therapists that are delivering CBT. And you can see that the next one on the list is Amanda. She has lots of availability in her diary. Not quite such a high prediction for recovery, but you may want to actually use that. Now, the point is, this is not recommendation. This is not telling any therapist what they should do. It's just giving them more information using the data that's already available to inform their clinical decision-making processes. And because it's machine learning, the machine doesn't start out by being an expert. We need to kind of go through this process and for therapists to make their own clinical decisions and teach the machine actually which decisions are good and which are bad. So we actually don't want therapists to do exactly what this says. We actually want them to go against it and teach the machine so it gets better and better and better. And at the lunch break, if you get a chance, do go to our stand in the corner where it actually shows you how machine learning works. And there's a really good kind of game you can play which actually shows how the machine actually learns to play a very, very simple game, but it takes a number of iterations to do that. I've not got slides full of regulations and all of the ethics and the kind of stuff that we have to go through. James has already kind of provided a lot of that information. But yes, we have to look at all of that clinical safety aspects and of all of this at the same time. Our project as a whole is divided up into a number of modules, as you can see here. It's a bigger version of what you saw earlier. We already have a digitised referral process, so lots of patients are now referring themselves into IAPT services. You can see in the top left-hand corner the standardised assessment that we want to create during the next few months. We then want to digitise that assessment. And then introduce something called behavioural preferences, which I'll talk about in a moment, build up the patient profiles, use all of that data to do digital triage. In other words, to save all of that time that therapists are currently spending by actually helping, automatically trying to signpost patients. We then have machine learning modules that we're building that not only predict the treatments and the outcomes that patients might get, but also whether they're likely to engage, whether they're likely to engage with the service, whether they're likely to drop out halfway through, whether they're likely to DNA their appointments, all using the power of the data or patients, the phenotyping that we've collected at the assessment point. And then at the end of all of that, yes, there will be the insights and the predictions, but we actually also are building the means for patients to book and manage their own appointments. So from the very point that they get referred right through to the end of treatment, we are trying to digitize and automate as much of that as possible. We've done some feasibility work last year. I only briefly talk about this slide. What we discovered was there was widespread support for actually creating a standardised assessment across services. And work is already going on in London, as we heard earlier on that, in terms of informing the digital triage. We ourselves actually had a workshop last November where 24 clinicians from around 22 services, I think it was, kind of came together. And what we discovered was that the problem was even worse than we thought in terms of the variability of the assessment processes. So it's actually quite a complex picture that we have to try and knit together. Good news though on the digital assessment. In one service, we've actually built the assessment process into the self-referral process. So patients will self-refer and then they actually fill out assessment questions themselves. One big question is, will they do it? Will they answer all that many questions as they kind of go through the entrance of the service? And the answer is yes. That is actually happening and patients are filling out the full assessment process at the doorway of the service. And we've also built some machine learning algorithms. The examples you saw earlier on the slide were all fictitious, they were made up. But actually what we discovered when we used some real data was that at the time with the data set we used, the average recovery rate was actually 50% for that data set. But the machine was actually recommending treatments and combinations of things, which on average were actually, it was predicting would push that up to 62.5%. And for those patients that actually did end up in recovery, it was predicting that their outcome measures would actually improve by 5% more than they actually did in real life. So based on that feasibility study, we kind of then applied for a grant from SBRI to take this work forward, and thankfully they thought it was a good application and it gave us the funding. I'm not going to dwell on this slide. I said the other one won't see the light of day. It's actually simply for data reasons. A lot of the cohorts of patients that come out of that process, there wasn't enough data for to actually make accurate predictions. We started to mess around with other layouts for what this insight dashboards might look like. This is a recent variation, but actually what we want to do is actually work with you to really understand what this should look like, and in a way that actually is very easy for people to access and which is non-threatening and where people don't have to be too technical to understand what's going on. I mentioned behavioural preferences earlier. When I first started, one of the first conferences I went to, I was really struck by one of the speakers who was reporting back the results of a research project on how important the therapeutic alliance was, i.e. the rapport between the patient and the therapist. And from this particular study, which was an American one, what they said was that actually 52% of the outcomes was actually correlated with that therapeutic alliance. It's really important that the patients and the therapist kind of get on the same so that, the same level, and yet, and I've since seen lots and lots of studies which are actually saying the same thing. The percentage isn't always the same. I think the smallest I've seen is 30%, the largest I've seen is around 60%, but it clearly is a really important factor. In the initial research we've done, what's been quite interesting is that the worlds of behavioural psychology and clinical psychology actually don't overlap very much. We don't actually look at whether we can match patients to therapists, very well. So we're actually doing a very initial piece of research built into this project, which actually look at whether we can do something about that. And today, Sonia is here. Just stand up, Sonia. We're working with Sonia from CME, where actually we're looking for one service, just one of the art services to look for, where we can actually look at the profiles of behavioural preferences for the therapists and actually also see if we can profile the behavioural preferences of the patients as well as part of the assessment, and then actually use that data to see if there's any correlation between the way that therapists like to communicate and patients, to see if there's any correlation with good outcomes between that. And if we find that there is, then obviously that's something that we can build into our processes going forward. But Sonia will be around the Mayden stand at lunchtime, and we'd absolutely love to talk to anyone who's interested in this. Finally, we need your help. This is not something that we can do alone. We need lots of collaboration to get these sorts of projects off the ground. There are lots of opportunities to get involved. And there is a poster upstairs which actually has all of the opportunities written on it. Please have a look at that, and if there's anything you're particularly interested, then please approach any of the Mayden staff. There is also a thought paper which will be on the Mayden stand at lunchtime. We don't have enough copies for absolutely everybody, but we do have it available in PDF as well for those of you who don't like paper. But that talks a lot more in detail about our SAPIO projects and actually what we're trying to achieve. So please go ahead and pick up a copy. And with that, I will wish you all a pleasant lunch and a pleasant, particularly a networking opportunity over the next hour or so. Thank you.